Well, hey, Anson, it's good to see you again, and thanks for carving out the time to chat with me.
Yeah, excited to be here.
Maybe just to get started, how about you share your background and a little bit of an introduction, and then I think it'll be clear to the folks who are listening why we're talking.
Yeah. So I got a PhD in cognitive science and neuroscience from University of Colorado Boulder. Ended up moving out to do my postdoc at Stanford. I worked with one of the world's most famous clinical psychologists. He's done probably more than anyone to understand the causes of different forms of mood disorders like depression, anxiety. I was really close to being a professor, had on-site interviews, but for a variety of reasons, one being that I was growing pretty disillusioned with academia, I decided to leave and head into academia or into industry. And yeah, one of those reasons is just that we're doing so much to understand the causes of mental illness, but so little to scale up its solutions. And that's part of the reason when I saw the opportunity to join Calm as a founding data hire, I hopped on it because I knew of the potential of meditation to alleviate mental struggles and to even help people who are suffering from a mental illness like depression. I spent 5 years there, built out the data organization, running data eng and data science. I left about a year ago, took a sabbatical, and then more recently started a new company, raised a pre-seed round this last fall. The company is called Mental. We are focused on mental health for men. And right now, there's so many mental health apps out there in the space, and it feels very red ocean, except for when you take another closer look at it, you realize that almost all the apps out there are built either explicitly or implicitly for women. And we're the first one that is being geared specifically to men.
Gotcha. I definitely have a few questions about that I'll circle back on later. But one of the first things that I wanted to key off of is, so you're an entrepreneur. It's well known that entrepreneurship is extremely taxing on our emotional and nervous systems. And then you also have this PhD in cognitive neuroscience. So it seems like you've got one of the more ideal sort of pedigrees or backgrounds in terms of arming yourself with wisdom and knowledge about how to be able to manage your own mental well-being going into something as difficult as starting a company. So I guess the question is, when you look back at it and you connect the dots now as an entrepreneur, are there any major takeaways or real insights from your academic background that you now apply as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, there's a ton. When you just spend years studying the brain in psychology, there's just so many valuable lessons that come out of it. In fact, like if people go into therapy or coaching, sometimes part of what you get out of that is that you get insights into your specific life. But a lot of what you can get if you go to the right type of therapy or coaching is that you learn how your mind works. And you learn all these different types of tools that you can use. So basically, without going to therapy, I was able to learn all this kind of stuff just from studying it for ages. And yeah, it's tremendously useful. So for example, my research was focused on rumination. I wanted to understand why we just get stuck on repetitive loops, thinking about the same thing over and over again. It could lead to depression, anxiety, and all kinds of problems if you don't get a hold of it. And the thing is, that's one end. There's also from the research, it shows that some people, they go the exact opposite end where they don't think about what's going on, any types of problems. They distance themselves from it. And really, they distract themselves from it, often with alcohol or other methods. And what I really found is that there really is this fine line you have to walk between thinking enough about things going on where you're processing it and also realizing there are times where you need to distract and let it go when you're going overboard. And then talking about tools, it's in this particular example with repetitive thinking or rumination, it could happen. You're going through a breakup and you kind of can't, you're just obsessing over it. Or it could be, as a founder, something didn't work out as planned, or you got maybe conflict with someone on your team. Are you able to let that go? There's some degree you do need to process it, but you don't want to over process it. There's a balance point that you need to be going for. And then there's also tools for how to process it better. So for example, one of them is you could talk to yourself in third person. So I'll actually do this. I'll be like, hey, Anson, you got this. Or, Anson, do this. Talk to yourself as though you're talking to a friend. And it's just like this slight shift in how you talk and think, but it actually creates a little bit of a mental distance. So instead of getting totally caught up and lost in drama or something hard that's going on, or a loss or something that didn't work out, kind of see it from a different perspective. I know we could be really hard on ourselves, especially entrepreneurs, when things don't work out. But if we were to ask our friends the same question about like, how are we doing? What do you think I should be doing in this situation? They wouldn't be nearly as hard on us. So it's almost like change your self-talk to add that self-distance in that third person, and suddenly you become a friend to yourself again. There's just so many different types of tools I've learned from my years in academia of like how the mind works and the tips and tricks for being able to like fine tune it.
Well, and two things. I guess the first is a reaction to that. As somebody who had been diagnosed with OCD, I'm definitely familiar with tendency towards rumination and obsession. And that's one of the tools, the one you mentioned, is basically have a conversation with yourself. And there are different fields for the folks who are listening. You can check out internal family systems as an example, and various aspects of cognitive behavioral therapy that I've experienced, where I basically learned these methods to talk to myself. And in doing so, give myself a moment of being present. But then also the thing I noticed was that when I talk to myself, I basically identify sort of the cognitive dissonance that I may be experiencing at the time. And just by bringing awareness to that cognitive dissonance, I then sort of almost immediately feel the nervous system shut down. So for example, I would get stuck in these loops when I was an executive, obsessing and worrying about, what was going on over here, what was going on over there. And commonly that obsession, when you really can take a step back and take a look at what you're obsessing or ruminating about, it almost always revealed to me, like, here's reality. And then this is where my brain, this is where my brain had taken me. And I realized, just like you said, it's like, oh, okay, everything's all right. It's not, reality is not reflective of this extreme scenario I just came up with in my head. Let me have a conversation with myself and bring me back to reality. So that was the first. And then the second thing I want to dig a little bit deeper on is, like you said, you learn how the mind works. And I love to ask this question to folks who really understand the nature of the mind, is if you were to try and explain how the mind works in, imagine I'm 12 years old, like what would your explanation of how the mind works? What would it be? The reason I ask that is I've personally benefited from just gaining a little bit of additional knowledge from time, to where then I can say, I can put my finger on what my brain is doing. And just being able to give it a label or being able to describe it a little bit sort of takes the edge off of it, while at the same time making you feel less lonely, because you realize, oh wait, a lot of other people are also dealing with this. Mm-hmm. So that's why I want to ask the question. And I'd love to hear your take on, like, what is the brain doing and how does it basically work?
Yeah, interesting. So just kind of general level. Yeah, when you're sitting here, what's the brain up to?
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting. I think the big thing is where kind of go back and forth between this mind wandering, just like processing all the things that are already in there, state of mind, to really focus. I'm focused on this conversation. I'm writing something. I'm texting something. And we just go back and forth between those two. And the part that's just mind wandering, it's like you don't really have control over that. Things are just popping up out of the subconscious.
I saw a study on that recently where they basically asked the question, like, what is the mind doing? What is its natural tendency, or certain parts of the mind? And basically the experiment was set up to where people weren't necessarily meditating, but they were instructed and were sitting and just sort of not being productive, not really doing much. And then they had the brain all wired up and what have you. And basically the takeaway was, at least the modern outside layer of the brain, what it does is exactly what you described. Like, its default state is, I just want to start thinking about stuff. Mm-hmm. Anyhow, sorry to interject, but I said, that's consistent with my experience.
If you spend some time in meditation and you start being able to observe, that part of your mind just going at it will surprise you. I just remember I went through a period of meditation and I started realizing, like, observing the sounds of commercials, like the songs from a commercial that would just pass through my mind. And I'd be like, I don't remember watching that commercial anytime recently, but it was like there. And I was like, oh, wow, those advertisers are really effective because that's just like hidden underneath there and just ready to like pop out at any point in time. So you could be really surprised at what's going on underneath there. And I also think people do, and when you look at studies, a lot of people actually, when they're mind wandering, there's a lot of negative thoughts that pop up. They're really common. And there's a reason for it. Like there's potentially a problem, someone you need to put a little attention to that you haven't given attention to, and potentially a threat, etc. So like our mind likes to surface those sorts of things. But some people observe when they have those negative thoughts where they're like, oh, something is wrong, or something's wrong with me for having all these negative thoughts. And that's almost like the rumination part where they start worrying about why is this happening. But that's actually just really normal. Everyone experiences that. If you just let people's minds wander, they're going to spend some amount of the time worrying about who they are, how they're doing. Everybody has that. So it's like, I think that going back to my time in academia, like something you get from it is like you learn what is normal and what's not. And sometimes when you realize like, oh, me thinking this way is really normal, it helps you feel better about it.
Yeah, to realize you're not the only person having these ongoing conversations with whoever is living rent free in our head. Right?
Yeah.
So you also brought up meditation. And one of the other things I find interesting about your background, and I'd love to hear the story of this, is you've spent time in silent meditation in the Himalayas. Is that right?
Yeah, I've done a few different retreats over time.
Okay. Are we talking days, weeks, months?
Yeah, never a really long one. Weeks the longest one. Yeah, I would love to do a month or two one, but I have to wait for my children to grow up.
What did you take away from those retreats that you apply for yourself today?
You know, I was talking about all these tools I learned, what type of knowledge I gained from my time in academia. And knowledge is tremendously helpful, but with tools, just knowing the tool is insufficient. You also have to practice it. So, I mean, one, what I took away from it is just the power of a practice of taking tools, and repeating the usage of them over and over again. Meditation itself is a hugely powerful tool. The big thing is, I think there's like kind of two sides to what it could do to you. Is like, one is that it gets you to like kind of check in and have these little moments where you suddenly become present again, as we get so lost in our thoughts that we were just talking about, that mind part and the subconscious pinging around saying like, think about this and that, where you just have a moment where you're like, oh, where am I? You know, like, oh, I'm actually, not working right now. I'm with a kid and I want to be present, or I'm in the middle of something important and I'm mind wandering. I should actually focus here. So it enables you to kind of have that like pull back into the moment if you train it. And then it also enables you, when you do get back into that moment, to just have like this really deep mindfulness and presence where you are really grounded in the moment. And beauty about something like being grounded and mindful in the moment, I feel like people hear about mindfulness a lot, and I'm sure people even fully get like how powerful it is. And I think one side of it is that when you're just mindful and you're there, it enables you to have a sense of awe about what it's like to be alive that I feel like is missing whenever we're mindful. You really not only take in that sunset, but you take in this opportunity to have a conversation with a friend or that time with your partner. Like, life just goes so quick. We forget about it. We get so caught up in our careers, our companies, etc. And mindfulness is that thing that reminds you about it. And I think cultivating a sense of awe in your life is probably one of the most important things you could do for your mental health. And also just to take advantage of this really short, little magical life that we're given. So you have the awe side, but I think it's also the suffering side. For people who meditate a bunch, they probably know this equation. Most people think suffering equals pain. I'm in pain, something bad happened, that's suffering. But suffering really is pain times by your resistance to that pain. How much are you fighting against it? As if, you can think of it physically, like, hey, broke my arm. That's painful its own right. And there's going to be some suffering from that no matter what. But a lot of the pain people go through is like, oh, well, if my arm's broken, then I won't be able to do X and I won't be able to do Y, and it's going to lead to all these problems, and we'll spend all this money on the medical care bills, and our mind go to these great lengths to like figure out all the ways it's going to be bad for you. That's most of your suffering right there. You take that away, and the pain of the arm is actually pretty manageable. And even the pain itself, like if you kind of focus in on it, how bad it actually hurts, it's usually not as bad as you think if you're just like, stop fighting it. So I think meditation gives you this ability to just like stop resisting the things that are actually happening, and that is like, as founders and entrepreneurs, you have to be resilient. There's just no way about it. You're going to lose a lot. Things aren't going to go right. But you're going to take a lot of hits. So we need that resilience to be able to take that hit and get back up on our feet. And when you take that hit, if you are in pain from the hit, plus you start resisting it, you fight it, and you go to these emotional depths, it's really hard to get back on your feet again. But if you just accept that pain as what it is, don't fight it, learn your lessons, you'll get back up on your feet faster. And even if your goal is just to make your company successful, figuring out ways to reduce that resistance is the thing that's going to make you resilient and help you actually move through those losses and get to the wins faster.
It's something that this notion of surrender, of acceptance is something that I've become much more in touch with personally over the last year and a half. And it has made a huge difference, because in the past, my tendency was to fight and resist. And I love the way that you framed this, because I now realize that all of the resistance I was putting up was just resistance to what is, like to the truth of the situation. And the thing that actually brought me the most suffering and pain was just the resistance, not the situation itself. And that's been a big shift that it made in my life. Is it could be small stuff. You plan a trip or a vacation. This happened actually not too long ago. I was expecting an email saying, hey, it's time to book into your flight. I didn't get that email. I call, and the next thing you know, it's 3 hours on the phone trying to figure out why my flight disappeared. And I think normally I would erupt, right? And make the situation much worse, and then carry that sort of intense energy or anger with me. But now it's sort of like a daily practice on my side that whenever something doesn't go according to plan, my initial reaction, and sort of slowly train myself to do this, is to go, okay. So I turn it into like a dialogue with myself, but the dialogue's quite simple. It's like, yep, I'm going to accept exactly what is happening right now. And by doing so, that's actually the smoothest path forward, where I do feel it, like a significant reduction in the amount of stress and pain and suffering I would have felt otherwise. That's a brilliant point for founders. Every single day, there's stuff that goes wrong, where the tendency is to want to resist it. It's hard for me to think of a scenario where resistance makes a lot of sense, because at the end of the day, resistance is just ignoring the factual reality of what's happening.
Yeah. And you're also not learning. The resistance usually is not learning either. It's just fighting, right? I think it's like the learning, the growth mindset when something doesn't work. That's kind of like accepting, okay, it happened. What do I learn? Like, how do I take this forwards? I want something from this. You kind of approach it instead. You study it. You study that loss. And so when you're fighting, you're not learning. So you're not able to solve that next problem faster.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So that's a great nugget, is sort of this Eastern spiritual notion of non-resistance, just awareness and acceptance of the reality of the situation. And then surrender doesn't mean don't do anything about it. It means observe and understand what is happening and accept the reality. And then based on that acceptance, then move forward.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It doesn't mean not doing anything about it. I even remember this, I kind of remember it fuzzily, but it was a story of a Buddhist monk who went into town and on a cart was traveling with a couple of people, and then someone tried to steal some bags off their cart, and the Buddhist monk hit the person on the head with their cane, and the people with the monk were surprised. And basically it was like, just because I'm a monk doesn't mean you don't do anything. There's still actions you have to take.
Yeah, it's not an invite to just steal all their shit.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's almost like the view sometimes of like, the acceptance. Oh, I'm just fine with anything. It's like you're accepting, not resisting, but you're still taking actions. You're
Yes.
still moving forwards.
Yeah. And that's where I've noticed that language of resistance and acceptance and surrender tends to be, there's like this immediate sort of like involuntary reaction from most people in Western countries where, it's so much of our language and the way that we think about things is like, no, move forward, go get it, change it, fix it, take shit. And this surrender and acceptance doesn't mean don't do anything. So you can still be very gung ho and do something about it. Just accept the situation for what it is at first. So I get this is a bit of a doozy. So maybe we might have to walk into this one a little bit. This is a question as it relates to identity, our sense of self, and how whether you're a career ladder climber, or somebody who's always been successful, or an athlete, or an entrepreneur, anyone who's really trying to perform at the high end of what they do, it seems inevitable that our sense of identity becomes very closely coupled with our success and what we do. And this is especially challenging for entrepreneurs who experience the ups and downs where their sense of self-worth tends to be directly correlated with how well the company is doing. And of course, there's an obvious pitfall there, which is if things aren't going well, then the tendency is to think not only in terms of sort of this rumination and tendency towards negative thinking and disaster, but to apply that to oneself and say, well, I guess I'm just not good enough. I'm not cut out to be an entrepreneur, or I'm not going to succeed. So I guess the question is, for this challenge of one's identity being so closely attached to the work we do, namely starting companies, how do you think about that problem or that potential challenge? And what are your thoughts, not only for yourself, but for other entrepreneurs on that subject?
Yeah, that's a great question. And very true. I was just talking to a friend of mine who's a founder, and there's actually 4 of them as founders. And 2 of the founders are just really struggling around like the risk of the company not taking off, and some like the struggles as they're trying to push towards a Series A, but not quite arriving there. And the conversation about it was kind of like a couple of things were clear to me. One was that for myself and also the friend I was talking to, we're at least in a fortunate position where we've had some successes under our belt. That's a privileged position to be in, where I feel like, I've got PhD, integral part of building up one successful company. So I feel like for me to say this, it's a little bit okay for me to like take a swing for the fences and fail, because it's I've done some other things I'm proud of. And I can understand a younger person who maybe hasn't had some of those successes where they're like, if this doesn't work, then it's like, so far my whole career, I haven't done anything. And it can be really consuming to their identity. This one win is like the whole win that matters. I understand how that could take over a person's mindset. I do think, though, a really big difference as well between like, say, me and my friend and these other couple founders that we're talking about is because they did get into that mindset mode, is what the risks, the challenges, the slog, the difficulties, they started viewing all of them as a threat. If this doesn't work out, then I'll fail. Then I haven't succeeded financially, status-wise, etc. And when you start viewing things as a threat, you get stressed, but you also start procrastinating. You start avoiding. You start trying to hide from it. You start drinking alcohol and to help yourself handle it. There's all kinds of negative things you start doing when you're confronted with a threat all the time. But one tool from the cognitive science literature is reframing threats as challenges. So my friend and I, we actually like, when we're in these situations where it's like really hard, we're struggling, we don't know if it's going to work. To me, it's like a challenge. I'm like, I think it's possible to do this. I am going to do this. And it's like, but then I start breaking it down. When I see it as a challenge, I start being like, well, how do I break it into little solvable chunks? How do I pull it apart? Like, how do I like get some creativity in there? And I just start thinking about how to solve it. And I stop caring about how it reflects back on me. So it's like, If you reframe these kind of risks instead of being threats as challenges, your stress levels come down. And the benefit is when your stress levels come down, you actually then do become more creative. You actually are more likely to solve the problem. Your company's more likely to be successful. So it's almost like these cycles. If you view it as a threat, the odds of you not succeeding grow. And if you view it as a challenge, the odds of you succeeding actually increase. And that's like, it's mindset. Mindset is just such a key thing here. You have to kind of keep reminding yourself that and actually it's one thing I do love about the tech community, how much people talk about, hey, failure's okay. Fail 9 times. It's the 10th time when you win. That's like, just keep pushing through it. You never know when you're on the edge of that success. And so it's like swinging for the fences and failing. That's a beautiful thing. Good for you. You swung for the fences. You should take pride in that effort and putting yourself out there. There's so many people I feel like who live a life of like, where they try to stay secure. They have the secure jobs. They don't take those risks. And they make it to old age. That's not something that they're going to appreciate. They won't look back and be like, well, I'm glad I never took any risks. I was always very nice and secure in my job. That was a good life.
And there's been plenty of like longitudinal studies covering decades where they have hundreds or thousands of participants, and they basically ask them these questions. What do you regret? What do you not? And so, the research supports exactly what you said. Time and time again, I wish I would have done the things I really wanted to do and took those shots.
Yeah, took the shots, tried, take the risk. Even if it doesn't work out, the fact that you're trying to do that, you will look back on that and appreciate yourself as being someone who is bold, who tried to take advantage of this short life we're given. And so I think if we kind of have that as our mindset of like, it's not about this end result, the success is what matters in terms of like the type of person we are. The type of people we are as entrepreneurs are the people who are okay with risk, okay with putting ourselves out there, the people trying to push things forward. You're already that person, whether your company succeeds or not. So I think we need to kind of remember to maintain those types of mindsets. And I think one big challenge to it is that it's like, hey, I'll hear this. Maybe I'll read a book, listen to podcasts. It will sink in. And I'll be like, that is important. And I'll remember it for a few days, but then I'll get caught up in the next thing that doesn't work. And I'll go back. I'll start viewing it as a threat again. I'll be like, but if my company doesn't succeed, I have to go get a new job doing something different that I don't like as much, or start a new company and start all over. And you suddenly just descend back into it. And I do think, going back to what I said earlier about like finding ways to practice stuff daily, like with mindset, you need ways to just daily give yourself a nudge, a little bit of a push each day. What's the right mindset? Keep reminding yourself. So you have to find ways to keep that going. Otherwise, it is pretty easy to kind of get lost into the struggles of the type of work we do.
Yeah. And then all of a sudden your identity becomes a predominantly negative one. And that's not a fun place to be in. Right.
No.
And related to that, on this point of having the right mindset and being resilient and translating challenge or these problems into opportunities, like one of the things that I think is deeply tied up in that, and the advice I try to give to entrepreneurs or people who are thinking about starting companies in particular, is I say, like, really take your time. I know that for some folks, there's this drive of like, I want to start a company. The time is now, right? And it's great. Come in with that enthusiasm, but really take the time to allow the idea, the thing you want to do, to reveal itself, and to make sure that like the company you choose to build really is an expression of the thing that you're just so interested in and passionate about. Because we know for sure the startup journey, especially venture-backed businesses, like you're immediately put on the clock, and that it doesn't stop. It just keeps going until you either disappear or you become a public company. Like, it's very freaking difficult. And it's way worse if you allow the enthusiasm or the excitement to start a company to push you into picking a thing that you work on a bit prematurely. And that thing is interesting, but it doesn't become like that real unique expression of what you want to do. And so term it idea selection. Whatever startup you choose, like give it more time. And until you find that thing where you're like, I'm going to try this no matter what, and it's going to be freaking cool because I just really want to try this. And it doesn't mean that if that thing fails, that you're still not going to feel bad. But from what I've experienced, I've seen entrepreneurs where it didn't sort of work out in the traditional venture sense, but they learned so much through that journey and they were focused on something that they really cared about, to where then they made a second attempt at it later, not using venture capital dollars and taking, call it like a more slow growth approach, but they turned it into something successful. And so they're able to stay on the thing that they were passionate about. So anyhow, I think all that is tied up in idea selection and trying to fight off the pressures that are so common in tech around wanting to drive talented people towards starting companies, but sometimes it drives people towards the wrong idea too quickly. And that's going to blow up in your face from a, call it a wellness or a happiness perspective at some point. It's got to be the right thing.
Yeah, definitely talked with founders. I have kind of picked the right, like an idea, it seemed like a good business opportunity. And some of them, it actually was a good business opportunity. They made money off of it. But when you start a company that's venture backed, yeah, you're in it for the long haul. It's a really long journey. And some of these founders I've talked to have been pretty miserable and have talked about, I just picked this to seem like a good idea to make money. And now I'm years in and I just want to be out of this.
Yeah.
Because there's like the opportunity cost. Someone's talked about the time you put in. Like, you're more invested than anyone. And it's not just financially, because you could be spending your time making money in all these different ways. So just putting that time in is money that you're putting into the company day after day. But it's also 5, 10 years of your life. It's your 30s, this whole decade of your life that you're doing something that you maybe don't like. Spending an extra month to figure out if that is what you want to do. And it's even like, that's 5 to 10 years, but then what's the job after that? Your whole trajectory gets impacted. So spend a month, figure it out, because then you'll live a very different life. It's a big decision. It's a big fork in your road when you start a company.
Yeah. And the flip side example of the same principle is the very public situation when, I forget his name, the founder of Minecraft, he sold it to Microsoft, I believe it was $3 billion or something like that. So clearly, and this was, his baby, right? So clearly a huge financial outcome, outrageous. But then it didn't take too long after that where he spoke publicly about like, yeah, I went and bought a $100 million home in Hollywood Hills and could have parties and all these things. But I was like so depressed. And what it revealed is that like he chose the right thing. He was building something that he was passionate about. And I think the regret was, well, that was my thing. And whether I sold it or not, I just wanted to keep working on it. I just wanted to share that as an example of how important it is to pick the right thing. When you do, it's going to give you that durability and the resilience and the longevity. And I think a switch in the cognition of like, okay, this is a challenge. This is not a problem.
My time at Calm, sometimes it could be fairly stressful. And have people write in about, hey, you guys literally saved my life. Or even have people come up to me on the street and say that while I had Calm gear on. And it was just like, the depth of meaning that I got from that just made all the other stuff worthwhile. I'm like, if I could spend my life doing this, where I'm like helping people, preventing them from getting that place in the first place, or helping them when they're there, then that is a good life lived. And so, you have that sense of meaning to push you through tremendous stuff.
Related to Calm, so you had the cognitive neuroscience background, and then the mindfulness and the meditation work, and then you're in the Himalayas, and then you've got the development of, I think, the most popular meditation app in the world. Were there any specific insights from that experience where, kind of like you said with the cognitive neuroscience background, is like it teaches you some fundamental things that then informs how you live your life day to day, both as a person and when you put your entrepreneur hat on? Or was there anything that you took away from the Calm experience that informs your work now as an entrepreneur?
Yeah, it goes back to my point right before this, is that people would always ask me, I got this question so often, is like, everyone in the Calm office, are they just sitting around in a full lotus position and like just very calm office? And I was always like, no, it's probably the most stressful place I've ever worked. And Calm was successful. We were growing. The reason it was stressful is because we were growing really quickly. It's like you'd have a job for like 6 months and you kind of make sense of it and you start figuring it out. And then suddenly it'd switch and you'd be like, oh, how do I do this next thing? You kind of had to keep leveling up, and there's just so much happening, so much change. And of like one of the lessons I've kind of taken from that, it's like, in the best case scenario, your company is successful. It's going to be stressful. And we all know it's going to be stressful if it doesn't work. So either way, deal with stress. Like that's just like the nature of being part of a startup world, especially as a founder or early person. If that's the case, then kind of going back to that pain by resistance formula, it's like, well, let's stop resisting the stress. We need to find ways to accept that, like, there's challenges and have a different way to approach them. We need to have a practice where we able to work on and handle our stress, because if we don't figure out ways to handle our stress, it's just going to be a miserable ride for 5 to 10 years, no matter how it goes, whether it works or doesn't work. So it's like, it just really is a crucial part of the journey that you are spending the time, you're taking the time to work on your mindset, to work on tools that help you de-stress. It's just hugely important.
I have a funny anecdote from when I was at the Wealthfront, and can't remember what year it was. I think it was probably 2017. I was running product at the time and I was interviewing, trying to find more designers, PMs. And we had previously, like, I don't know, 6 or 12 months prior to that, we had a change in CEO, and we also had a change in our VP of product and our VP of engineering. And so understandably, any candidate that's interviewing at startups, they do their research, they pay attention to see, if they can gauge, are there any issues with this company? And because this stuff was out in the tech press, then of course, I don't want to say common knowledge, but it was easy to find. And so I had many candidates where during the interview process, and it was always fun for me because it's almost like I could tell that they were afraid to ask the question as if they thought it was going to, offend me or, it'd catch me off guard. And they say, hey, yeah, the CEO left and a couple VPs, like, is there anything I should know, or is everything okay? Or what chaos is going on here that you don't want to admit to me?
Yeah.
And I'd always do the opposite. I'd say, oh yeah, it's chaos. And I'd say, my track record, at that time I could say, I was like, I'm 4 for 4. I've been at 4 early stage startups. And in every single case, there's been crazy executive level turnover plus all the other stuff. And that was my way of saying, I was kind of like the Zen Buddhist, like, yes, startups are suffering. And I could say that with a smile on my face because I just got so used to it. That was par for the course. And so I said, yeah, that absolutely happened. And give it 2 more years and it'll probably happen again. And then 2 more years after that, it'll probably happen again. What we're attempting to do, just to give it the right sort of cognitive frame, is kind of insane. Let's take a group of people that don't know each other, that have never worked together before, attempting to build something that's never been accomplished within probably a highly competitive industry. And then you're all going to get together and do that. And in less than 10 years, you're going to go from 0 to many billions of dollars. All right, go. That's the context, right? So
the baseline rates of failure is like 95%. So you're like, yeah,
exactly. I'm like, yeah. Again, accept the nature of what's going on, and then you'll realize, like, God, that takes away like 90% of what I was worried about.
Yeah, that's awesome.
All right. Now that said, I'm glad I don't want to do that again. 4 was enough, and I decided I'm all done with that.
Probably true. You probably have only so many rounds in the startup world. Yeah.
Let me ask you this question, and this kind of gets to the question of work-life balance for an entrepreneur, or if there is such a thing. You've gone on multiple sabbaticals yourself, and actually on LinkedIn, I was checking out your profile, doing a little bit of creeping on you. And you wrote next to one of the sabbaticals, you said, quote, "Sometimes you also need to slow down so that you remember why and where it is you're rushing off to." How does that fit into the practical daily life of entrepreneurship? This notion of slowing down from time to time, but also carving out the time and space to recover.
Yeah, it's such a great question. It's like we have kind of a busyness culture, right? Where we're doing things, and as entrepreneurs, there's so many different things. You're just like, rush, get it done. But it's like we're running all the time, and if you don't stop now and then, make sure you're running off to where you want to run to. It's like you could just waste a tremendous amount of time. And for me, that was kind of like a pause before, calm going into this, starting up Mental, my new company, is figuring out what did I want to do. I mean, there's parts where I was like, kept growing my career in other sorts of ways. And I feel like that's probably what I would have done if I just had to kind of go right into the next job and just kind of kept running. I would have been like, well, what's the next step up a career ladder kind of thing, and kept pushing. And I had to stop and remind myself, check in, be like, well, what are the things you've cared about for all these years? Like, what impact do you want to make on the world? You run the time. So like, this is like your next chance. How do you want to spend it in the next 5 years, 10 years? And that made it really clear to me what I wanted to do, which was mental. But even the same thing, it's like, in the day-to-day of your work life, I think the best ideas of like what we should do next as a company, what's working, what isn't, what lessons should be learned. I feel like you often get them when you slow down, when you take a pause, when you are not consuming anything. You're not listening to podcasts, you're not reading emails or Slacks, you're not responding, you're not like ticking off some task that's on your list. Like when you just stop and do nothing for a bit, sometimes it becomes really clear what the priorities are, what you care about, and what you guys are failing to do right now.
Yeah. That's where going on walks outside. That's going on walks in nature. It could be a trail just outside your backyard. It doesn't have to be on a mountain. But there's an awful lot of, scientific literature, but plenty of anecdotal evidence too around the benefits of just get out of the office, or if it's on a weekend or whatever, just go walk 30 minutes, hour, 2 hours. If you want to be like some of the great literary giants of American history, some would walk 6-7 hours a day.
Yep.
You don't have to do that, but like the getting away from the computer, and something about the motion, the bipedal motion of just walking. There's something about it that it's almost like it's stimulating a different part of the brain, and it begins to think in new and creative ways.
Yeah, that's actually my PhD dissertation. I was on a hike to go climbing by myself, was on the hike, and the ideas came to me, and I like kind of pushed them the next step forwards, and I had my dissertation idea and roll with it. It's like, you get wild ideas while walking by yourself. You just have to leave the iPods, like keep your the podcast off. Don't listen to us right now.
Exactly. Well, kind of leads into my next question then, is just talking about a practical toolkit for sort of maintaining your sanity and wellness while trying to do something extremely difficult. And if it's okay, I'll share a quick analogy, and then I'd love to ask you about your sort of toolkit for keeping your head above water. I mentioned entrepreneurs, especially those that go and raise significant capital. You're trying to do something hard. And the thing I encourage entrepreneurs to do is think of yourself like a professional athlete, where it's well known in the athletics industry, and this is why it starts even at the high school level, but certainly by the time you get into college, and most definitely they've perfected it at the professional level, is this clarity that, okay, you're going to do something difficult with your body and with your mind, but predominantly with your body as an athlete. You're going to push yourself. It's going to give you opportunities for growth, and you're going to sort of grow as an individual and rise to these new levels of ability. But rest and recovery and rehab and preparation is all an essential part of the daily routine of becoming an athlete that can perform at the highest level. And so they'll surround you with, okay, your daily schedule, you got to get plenty of sleep. And then here's the trainer that's going to sort of stretch you out and rub out the muscles and put you in an ice bath. And then here's this other person that's going to work on your sports psychology. And so you're sort of assembled with a team, and you're put into a very specific routine that is all set up to aid you in doing something very difficult at the highest level, but then being able to sustain that level of effort for a long period of time. LeBron James probably being one of the most famous public examples in the last few years, where he very, famously spends $2 million a year. Again, it's LeBron. We don't have that money. I get that. But he spends $2 million a year just on his post-game recovery. The stuff he does after a game to ensure that he recovers and then he sleeps well.
Yeah, I've heard that too.
Somebody with food and supplementation. There's somebody that's doing various forms of soft tissue work and what have you. He's got all kinds of stuff. A chef, I'm sure. Who knows what other stuff is going on. But anyhow, so that leads into what I say to entrepreneurs is like, think of yourself that way, where it's not enough for you to just, show up to practice every day at the office and then train really hard and go to bed and wake up and do it again. You'll be able to sustain that for a couple of years in the absence of any work rehabilitating and rest and recovery. And so start designing your day to incorporate all of those things that will help you sustain yourself moving forward. And so anyhow, that's the comparison I like to make. I hope that someday the venture capital industry also understands this comparison, and then maybe there's some mutual agreement to carve out a small amount of each financing to provide the resources to entrepreneurs to give them that support network. That's an aside. But I would love to ask, for you, what are the essential parts of your daily routine that just keeps you sane and healthy?
Yeah, I love this question. It's so true. Athletes, they have this whole routine. And people think about it, they're like, oh, as a performance of the athletes, it's just the physical training. And what is that's how they accomplish what they do. But you ask athletes and they're like, oh, it's 70% mental. And the really high performing athletes are also training the mental part. They realize that's how you do so well in those mental games. And then we get into the business world and we're just execute. And we don't put any work into that mental side, that mental training, when it's clearly super important. So if you're stressed, are you going to be creative? No. It's really hard to be creative. And a lot of our successes, entrepreneurs, is from that place of creativity. Are you going to be able to get back on your feet and solve the next problem? You don't have ways to handle the mental game. You won't. So your odds of success are hugely impacted by whether you have a good training around your mental game or not. Yeah. And for me, I do a variety of things. The thing I'm really been into, and actually what the mental app is training right now, is a protocol around the use of cold water itself has all these mental, physical impacts that are just fantastic mentally in its own right. But what I really like about cold is a little bit something more than that. Is when you get into cold, it's a hormetic stressor, which release adrenaline and noradrenaline. And it's this short burst that's too intense. So it's really tolerable. And if you could learn to handle those short bits of stress, you become much better at handling stress more generally. And so in the mental app, when we have guided cold showers, it's not just telling you motivating you or telling you how long to do it to develop a habit, but we're actually teaching you all these kind of tactical tools around breath work, body relaxation, self-talk, mental clarity, and getting you to practice that in the stress of cold. Because if you could practice those tools in that context, the really cool thing is they become kind of the automatic reflexive thing you will do in stress in other parts of your life. This isn't quite a work example, but just of showing how it came up. And actually is, I guess, related to the founder life, where you're just so busy, so many different things going on, days packed. And a couple weeks ago, my wife gave me some slack for not having loaded the dishwasher properly. And I was just I'm so busy. I have so many things to think about. This is just not important at all. And I was just totally peeved by it. Why even bring that up? I went to the bathroom and I just found myself taking doing this certain type of breath work. that calmed me down. Then I immediately went into like a body relaxation where I realized I was kind of like in a little bit of a fight mode, relax. And as soon as I was able to get out of that, I realized a self-talk that was going through my head, which was just me being pissy. And I was like, okay. So I changed the self-talk, and it's just those steps that like breath work, body relaxation, self-talk. I walked out of the bathroom and I was totally fine. And that's how I should have been. If I hadn't learned those tools and had been practicing them, it would not have popped up in that moment. And could be the same thing in your daily kind of like work life. So it's like, I do think we need to find ways to practice using these tools and then ideally practice them using them in context that's quite relevant, which to me is under stress. So that's been a really big part of like my training recently is that cold water for its own right and then the tools that I use in cold water. But I also have the practice that Huberman's great, that sitting in the sun in the morning, just getting sunlight is like, we know it has impacts on like setting your circadian rhythm. So you sleep better, you have more energy during the day. It gives a boost in dopamine, which is basically the neurochemical that makes you feel motivated. But there's just something pleasant if you get a little bit of sun of just sitting there and slowing down, which is, I think, really like the third thing that I really intentionally build into my life. And that's actually, I had a question recently from someone. He's like, you're a hard charger. Like, what to you would be like a pro tip for anyone who's like charging hard to be successful? And I was like, it's really counterintuitive. But if you know me, maybe not so much. I tell people to do nothing. When you go for a drive, don't listen to a podcast. Just don't do anything. Go for walks. Don't do anything besides that walk. You just need the downtime. Sit in that sun. Don't do anything. I think that makes just a tremendous impact on your mental well-being. And it's like, at Calm, we saw sleep stories were really popular. And I think part of the reason for that is because people are so busy throughout the day, they never stop. So when they turn the lights off, that's like the first time they let the wandering mind take over again. And so then it's just like, whoa, all these things you should be doing, you've forgotten to do. And then you can't fall asleep. But so you could use a sleep story and cover it up. I feel like that's kind of a Band-Aid in the long run. You should be trying to do something to address those thoughts, not just cover them up. And one of the things that you can do is give them space, let them out. There's actually a ton of creativity in those thoughts. So it's like some of your best ideas will come in those moments. But even failing that, it's what your mind needs. It just needs a little bit of breathing room. So that do nothing, I think it's just like train specific tools and then also give yourself some time to just like mind wander and just let your mind do whatever it wants to do.
Yeah, it's actually a really interesting point about, so basically people are staying busy all day and we just find ways to be busy. The chattering mind wants to chatter, but it's almost like suppressed and sort of tamped down for a little bit just through the frenetic energy of being busy. And then you go and you put your head on the pillow where it's time to not be busy. And then the brain's like, okay, I got all these thoughts, right? I know a lot of people, including myself, that fall into that category.
Yep.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. If you get some space during the day, I bet you it will go down dramatically.
Yeah. Actually, related to that on the subject of meditation, from my personal experience is like, I would basically do two types in the morning. And it was an opportunity to basically bookend the day, but like give myself a real fresh mind, a calm nervous system before the day began. One was the typical meditation of, focus on breath or focus on something. And then through the process of focus, you just sort of go quiet. And that for me was definitely beneficial at the beginning of the day before I got involved with any of my work stuff, before I even looked at an email. But the other type I would do is I've heard it referred to as inbox zero meditation, which is basically sit and meditate, but like let my mind do exactly what you said. Let it exercise that desire to just jump all over the place where I'm sitting there. Next thing I know, I'm like, why am I thinking about Captain Crunch cereal? I don't know why, but I don't know why that came up. And then the next thing I know, I'm thinking about a SQL query. And then it's just all over the place, but allow it to happen. It's like you're just letting it vent out, and eventually that inbox of sporadic ideas just after 20, 30 minutes just fell down to zero. And then if I wanted to do this sort of focused meditation and just sit in that calmness, I would. The one's fine, but I definitely endorse, and like your point about like find moments throughout the day to let the chatter out. And the way to do it is basically sit and do nothing.
Yeah. Never heard of the term inbox zero. I like that. That's totally true. The insight or Vipassana silent retreats, so multi-day ones, usually they begin by a couple days where you focus on something very specific, like just focus on your breath or the air moving on your nostril. Over and over, you bring your breath back to it. And it's really hard to do as you're kind of caught up in all the things outside of the retreat, your work life, etc. And over the first day is miserable. Second day, you kind of start getting a little bit of a flow and are able to kind of remain focused for longer periods of time. And at that point, the retreats often switch into kind of like an insight mode, which is the inbox zero mode, where it's like, now let things flow through and you observe them. But now you're in a state where you could actually, instead of getting caught up into them, you can really see them for what they are. And sometimes it's the, I want some Captain Crunch thoughts coming through, which just make you laugh. But often what it would also do is like, it become really clear to you what was some important things going on underneath the hood. And you're like, I've been ignoring that. Every time that came up, I would try to distract myself. I would get deeper into work, and that's impacting me. It's just holding me down. And in that moment, you don't try to work on it. But when you come out of the retreats and you have a time to like integrate what you went through, you're like, this is something that just popped up and became so clear that I have been avoiding this thing and I need to deal with it. And it's like, yeah, there's magic in those moments where you just spend the time looking underneath the hood of your mind.
Yeah, and it goes back to, you got to structure the day to where that time is allowed. And as hard as it is, even when entrepreneurs have, they have kids and a family and everything else going on, it's still, you got to find the time for good food, some fitness. It doesn't have to be any more than 20 minutes. And I think an underrated thing is fun. Like fun is a simple way of thinking is like, we all kind of have this like life force in us and this energy that propels us forward in whatever we're doing. But if your food sucks, if your sleep sucks, if your relationships are non-existent and you're not having fun, those things, like you have nothing there to replenish that life force. That's what I use as my sort of cognitive tool now is I'll find myself working on something, working on this. And there are days where I got nothing there. And then it turns into a couple of days and I find myself dragging ass or uninspired and unmotivated. And I'm sitting there thinking like, wait, I'm very interested in this. So why do I feel like I have no drive to do this? And every single time it comes back to, of course, Andy, it's like, I've been out of balance. I haven't been spending time in the food, the fun, the family, the friends, the things that give me that life force. And so it's drained. And when that's drained, you can't pour into anything, whether it's going to the gym or building a company.
Yeah, if you could find ways to integrate that fun into the job, into the work, that was actually the best bit of the culture we had, especially early on at Columnist. We were just laughing all the time. It was so much fun. Even when it was stressful, even when we were working crazy hours, it was like just that ability to kind of laugh and be like, hey, first and foremost, we're having some fun here. Like, yeah, it's so rejuvenating.
Yeah, it wasn't until a few weeks ago where I stumbled upon some advice that Paul Graham of YC fame had given to entrepreneurs and all the amazing stuff he's written and spoken about. He's got plenty of startup wisdom there, but this one, I was like, he's so spot on. And I haven't heard anyone else talk about this, is when somebody asked him, like, what's the job of the CEO? And his answer was basically like, find a way to make it fun. Like the job of the CEO is to have fun. I haven't been a CEO. I've been a president of a company. I've been an executive of a company. And that hit me because when I look back at it, it's like, yeah, no wonder the job just felt so laborious and difficult at times because like I wasn't doing anything to just try and have fun with it. It all felt like a problem. None of it felt like a fun obstacle to sort of grapple with and figure out. There wasn't the fun.
Play. Yeah,
Yes.
It's like playing like a kid, right? I love that as a first-time CEO, thinking about my role as like how to make it playful, how to make it fun.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to take that tip with me.
And I think like when I thought about it, I was like, if I were to start a company, I'm not going to hire anybody who's not fun. Or at least like, you don't have to be the most exciting person in the world. That's not the objective. But if your tendency is towards negativity and doubt or it's all work and there's no fun, it's like, I'm never going to build that kind of company.
It just won't work early on. Yeah.
Yeah, especially early, right? When you got 6 people crammed into an old dry cleaner's office, right?
Yeah, and only like 1 out of 10 things going right. You got to keep the humor up.
Yeah, it was like, oh, we had 4 signups this week. We just need about 10 million more, and we'll be okay.
Exactly.
Well, hey, man, I think that's a good place to wrap this up. But if there's any final wisdom you'd like to share from your really interesting background as it relates to helping other entrepreneurs, keep their head above water, this is your time. If you just want to say good luck, that's fine too.
I guess maybe going back to the Himalayas, besides some meditation retreats, I soloed like a 20,000 foot and an 18,000 foot mountain on my own. And one of the tips that, get from mountaineering is when you hike, if you hike quick and you get out of breath, it takes you a really long time to recover. But if you just take slow steps, but they're steady and you never run out of breath, you don't have to stop. You end up getting to the top of the mountain a lot faster and it's a lot less miserable. So find ways, if you can, in your work life to remember it's like climbing a mountain. The sprints, if it's always sprints, you actually will get there more slowly. It's like steady, but solid.
That's great. That's great. Well, Anson, I appreciate it. Thank you for your time and for sharing all your wisdom, and wish you the best of luck, man.
Yeah, it's been great chatting with you.